October 14th, 2019. 8:42 p.m. A narrow dining room in a softly lit apartment on the edge of the city. The table is set too carefully for a casual evening. Four glasses, a bottle of red already open, low music almost nervous in its softness. Conversations overlap, light laughter, half-finished sentences, the ritual choreography of people trying to be liked. And then it happens. Someone across the table tilts their head slightly and says, almost playfully, "Wait, what did you mean by that?" The question isn't hostile, not exactly, but it carries weight. For years, you would have leaned forward right here, you would have clarified, softened, reworded, explained your tone, your intention, your choice of phrasing, you would have filled the space so no one could misinterpret you. Tonight you don't. You take a sip of wine instead. There's no tension in your jaw, no urgency in your chest, just silence. It's subtle, almost invisible, but the atmosphere shifts. A fork pauses midair, someone glances sideways, the music suddenly feels louder. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't rush to reassure. You simply allowed your words to stand on their own. And in that stillness, something reorganizes in the room. From a Jungian perspective, this is not about confidence in the superficial sense. It's about integration. Carl Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we once rejected or hid, our anger, our independence, our sharp edges, form what he called the shadow. For years, we negotiate with others to keep those parts acceptable. We explain so we won't be misunderstood. We soften so we won't be rejected. We clarify so we won't be abandoned. But when the shadow begins to integrate, when those disowned fragments are no longer exiled, the compulsion to manage perception dissolves. And people feel that. Not because you said anything different. Because you didn't. Across the table, the person who asked the question laughs lightly and moves on, but there's a flicker in their eyes, a recalibration. They expected movement from you, adjustment. Instead, they met stillness. And stillness is difficult to dominate. You can almost feel it, the subtle power of someone who no longer scrambles to repair the atmosphere. This isn't arrogance, it isn't coldness, it isn't indifference. It's self-containment. There was a time when silence would have burned. You would have replayed every word internally, scanning for damage. You would have tried to predict how each person might interpret your tone. Tonight there's no inner scramble. Just presence. That's when it becomes clear, you are no longer negotiating your existence. And the room knows it before you consciously do. Because when a person stops explaining themselves, they also stop asking, silently, for permission. The energy shifts from outward management to inward gravity. And gravity alters everything. But this shift didn't begin at this dinner table. It started long before, in quieter, lonelier rooms where no one was watching. And to understand why the air changed tonight, we have to go back to where the explaining began. February 3rd, 2008, 3:17 p.m. A classroom window half open to late winter air. You're 17, fluorescent lights hum above you. The teacher has just returned graded presentations and the word intense is written in blue ink at the top of yours. Not praise, not criticism, just intense. The classmate next to you leans over and whispers, "You know you don't have to sound so serious all the time, right?" You laugh, you nod, you say, "Yeah, I guess I get carried away." And just like that, a small negotiation is born. You begin translating yourself. Your thoughts, once delivered directly, now pass through filters. You adjust tone, add disclaimers, pre-soften your opinions. You watch people's faces as you speak, calibrating in real time. Was that too strong? Too quiet? Too certain? You become fluent in microadjustments. At family gatherings, when an uncle calls you too sensitive, you smile and explain that you just think deeply. When a partner says you're hard to read, you offer context, background, reassurance. You narrate yourself so others don't have to wonder. And slowly, without realizing it, your identity becomes something performed in anticipation of misunderstanding. From a Jungian perspective, this is the persona at work, the social mask designed to maintain belonging. Carl Jung believed we craft this outer layer carefully, shaping it according to what earns approval. You learned early which parts of you landed well. The agreeable parts. The humorous parts. The non-threatening parts. and you learned which ones required explanation. The quiet intensity. The refusal to laugh at something that didn't feel funny. The discomfort with shallow conversations. Those parts felt like friction, so you buffered them. But here's the invisible cost of living in translation. You start to feel slightly distant from yourself. Nothing dramatic, just a faint hum of exhaustion after social interactions, a sense that you've been subtly editing your own existence. You replay conversations at night not because you regret what you said, but because you're evaluating how it was received. Did they misunderstand? Should you clarify tomorrow? Did you come off too detached? It becomes a reflex, and the world rewards you for it. You're called considerate, self-aware, emotionally intelligent. But underneath that praise is a quiet tension, a constant monitoring of your impact. Years pass like this. College seminars, first jobs, relationships, dinners with strangers. Each room carries its own unwritten script and you adapt fluently. Your explanations become smoother, more preemptive. You learn to anticipate objections before they're spoken. You rarely leave things hanging in the air. Because silence back then felt dangerous. Silence could be misinterpreted. Misinterpretation could lead to rejection. Rejection felt like erasure. So you filled every gap. Until one day you noticed something unsettling. Even when people understood you, you didn't feel seen. Because they were responding to the version you had already softened. And somewhere inside, a question began forming, quiet but persistent. What would happen if you stopped translating? Not as rebellion. Not as confrontation. Just stopped. The first time you tried, it felt unnatural. You said something honest without cushioning it. You left a statement without follow-up clarification. You allowed a misunderstanding to exist without rushing to repair it. Your body braced for impact. But the impact didn't come. Instead, there was something else. A strange, steady calm. It wasn't that people suddenly agreed with you. It was that their reactions no longer defined your internal state. You began to notice how much of your explaining had been driven by anticipation, not actual threat. And anticipation is exhausting. Gradually, the compulsion weakened. You didn't announce it, you didn't decide, I will stop explaining myself. It just fell away. Because something deeper had changed. The parts of you that once felt unacceptable no longer needed defense. They were simply yours. And when the need to defend dissolves, something powerful replaces it. But power, especially quiet power, makes other people uneasy. And that's when the reactions started to shift. June 22, 2022, 11:06, a glass-walled conference room 22 floors above the city. The air conditioner hums steadily. A presentation slide glows against the wall, bullet points, revenue projections, controlled optimism. You're seated halfway down the table, legal pad open, pen resting diagonally across the page. Mark Jensen, Senior Vice President, finishes outlining a strategy that everyone has already decided to agree with. His voice carries the practiced authority of someone used to being followed. So, he says, glancing around the table, we're aligned, right? Heads nod. Eyes flick briefly toward you. In the past, this would have been the moment you cleared your throat gently. You would have prefaced your concern carefully. I might be wrong, but just to play devil's advocate, maybe I'm overthinking this. You would have padded the truth before placing it on the table. Today you don't. You lift your eyes and say evenly, I don't think this will work long term. No apology, no cushioning. The words land clean. Silence. Mark's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. Someone shifts in their chair. The hum of the air conditioner grows louder in the pause. You don't rush to fill it. You don't explain your tone. You don't smile to soften the impact. You don't add disclaimers to protect yourself. You simply hold the space. And this is where the shift becomes visible. From a Jungian perspective, when the shadow integrates, a person stops disowning their assertiveness. Carl Jung believed that the traits we suppress, especially strength and authority, don't disappear. They go underground, and when they return integrated, they don't shout, they settle. Your voice doesn't rise, it steadies. Mark leans back in his chair. Why not? There's a subtle challenge in his tone. You answer directly, clear reasoning, no emotional charge. But the real change isn't in what you say. It's in what you're not doing. You're not scanning the room for approval. You're not measuring your worth by their expressions. You're not adjusting mid-sentence to maintain comfort. You are anchored. And anchoring shifts hierarchy. People sense when someone no longer negotiates their presence. It introduces a quiet unpredictability, not volatility, but independence. You can almost see it happen. A colleague who once spoke over you now waits a second longer before interjecting. Another stops tapping their pen. There's a recalibration occurring beneath the surface. Because when someone stops explaining themselves, they also stop signaling insecurity. And insecurity is what others unconsciously organize around. When you remove it, the social geometry changes. The meeting continues. The strategy is debated more seriously now. Your perspective isn't dismissed, it's examined. But something else lingers in the room long after the discussion moves on. A subtle awareness. You are no longer positioning yourself below anyone's comfort. This is the part no one talks about. When you stop over-explaining, some people will feel destabilized. They were accustomed to your transparency not because they needed clarity but because it allowed them to gauge you, to predict you, to stay slightly above you. Now there's less access. Less explanation means less control. And control is comforting. Later, as you walk out of the building, the sun hitting the glass facade, you notice something inside your body. Stillness. Not triumph, not adrenaline. Just alignment. For years, you believed explaining yourself was kindness, emotional maturity, social intelligence. And sometimes it was. But often, it was a subtle form of self-erasure. A way of asking, is this version of me acceptable? Today, there was no such question. And the world didn't collapse. But the real transformation isn't how others respond. It's what happens internally when you realize you can withstand misunderstanding. Because the fear was never about disagreement. It was about disconnection. And now something deeper has replaced that fear. But with this new steadiness comes another realization, one that's harder to admit. Not everyone will stay comfortable around the version of you who no longer explains. And that's where the true test begins. November 3rd, 2023, 9:28 p.m. A quiet living room, warm lamplight pooling against the walls. Rain taps steadily against the windows. The television is on, muted. You're sitting across from someone who has known you for years, long enough to remember the version of you who used to narrate every feeling in real time. They're watching you carefully tonight. You've changed, they say. Not accusing, not admiring, just observing. In the past, you would have leaned forward immediately. What do you mean? In a good way or a bad way? I didn't mean to seem distant. You would have begun decoding their statement, eager to stabilize the emotional ground between you. Tonight you don't. You let the sentence sit. The rain fills the silence. They shift slightly, you're just harder to read now. There it is. Harder to read. What they mean is, you no longer offer access by default. You're not cold, you're not withholding, you still speak, you still care, but you're no longer performing transparency as reassurance. From a Jungian perspective, this is what happens when the persona loosens its grip. Carl Jung believed the persona helps us function socially, but over-identification with it can drain the psyche. When you begin to separate who you are from who you present, something changes in your relational energy. You stop managing how you're perceived. And that makes you less predictable. For some people, predictability feels like intimacy. If they know how you'll react, how you'll explain yourself, how you'll soften tension, they feel safe. But when you grow quieter, more internally anchored, they lose that script. And silence can feel like distance to someone who relied on your constant articulation. You look at them across the room. I don't think I'm harder to read, you say calmly. I think I just don't rush to explain anymore. The words land gently. But beneath them is something profound. You are no longer trying to ensure comfort at the expense of authenticity. There's a difference between emotional openness and emotional overexposure. For years, you equated explaining with connection. If someone felt unsure, you filled the gap. If tension rose, you dissolved it with context. But now, you understand something you didn't before. Not every silence needs repair. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every perception demands negotiation. And this realization doesn't make you distant. It makes you contained. Contained people feel different. They move more slowly in conversation, they respond instead of react, they don't scramble when someone projects onto them. You can almost sense it, the subtle boundary that now exists around your inner world. Not a wall. A threshold. And thresholds require intention to cross. The person across from you looks unsettled, though they might not consciously know why. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you also stop proving yourself. You're no longer saying, "Here, why I'm worthy of being understood." You're simply existing with or without their clarity. This shift can create space. And space reveals things. It reveals who was relating to your essence and who was relating to your accessibility. That distinction is uncomfortable. But it's clarifying. From a Jungian lens, this stage often marks a deeper individuation process, the gradual movement toward becoming psychologically whole. Individuation isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It feels like fewer words, steadier eyes, longer pauses. It feels like not chasing interpretation. But here's the quiet truth. When you become harder to read, you also become harder to manipulate. And that changes relational dynamics more than you expect. Because some connections were built on the version of you that over-explained. Now there's less to grab onto. Less reassurance. Less immediate emotional translation. And as the rain continues outside, you realize something almost sobering. Not everyone will feel at ease with the version of you who no longer overfunctions in conversation. Some will lean in. Others will drift. And the drifting can feel lonely. Which raises a deeper question. If you're no longer explaining yourself to maintain closeness, what remains when someone doesn't understand you? January 18th, 2024, 6:41 a.m. A nearly empty train platform, winter air sharp against your face. The city hasn't fully woken up yet, breath rises in faint clouds, a distant engine hums beneath the quiet. You're standing alone, hands in your coat pockets, replaying a conversation from the night before. Not because you regret what you said, but because you didn't fix it. Someone had misinterpreted your silence, assumed distance, perhaps even indifference. The old reflex flickered for a moment, clarify, soften, repair. And you let it pass. The train lights appear far down the tracks, small and steady. Here is the part no one romanticizes about growth. When you stop explaining yourself, you lose certain kinds of closeness. Not true closeness, but familiar closeness. There is a specific intimacy that comes from over-articulation, from narrating every emotional shift so no one has to wonder where they stand with you. It makes others feel included in your internal world without effort. Now there are pauses. Now there are moments where someone has to tolerate ambiguity. And not everyone can. From a Jungian perspective, individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, often brings a period of isolation. Carl Jung believed that as a person integrates more of themselves, they become less dependent on collective approval. But this independence can feel like standing slightly outside the circle. You're not rejected. You're just not performing belonging anymore. The train pulls in with a metallic sigh, doors open. A handful of commuters step inside, faces blank with early morning detachment. You find a seat near the window. As the city begins to move past you, a quiet realization settles in. The fear of being misunderstood was once louder than the fear of being alone. Now that hierarchy has reversed, you would rather be briefly misunderstood than constantly deluded. That's the shift. And it's not dramatic, there's no swelling music, no triumphant declaration, just a subtle internal recalibration. You no longer chase resolution in every relational tension. You allow space. You allow projection. You allow people to sit with their interpretation, even if it's incomplete. This doesn't mean you've become indifferent. It means you've stopped equating explanation with survival. For years, misunderstanding felt like threat. Because misunderstanding once meant disconnection. But you've learned something quieter, deeper. The right connections don't collapse under ambiguity. They lean closer. The wrong ones require constant translation. And translation is exhausting. Outside the train window, buildings blur into streaks of gray and gold. You catch your reflection in the glass, not dramatic, not hardened, just steady. There is a calm that comes from no longer curating your presence. But there is also a subtle grief. You're not as easily accessible as you once were, not because you're closed, but because you're no longer overexposed. And with that containment comes discernment. You begin to notice who steps forward to ask genuine questions instead of making assumptions. You notice who respects silence, who can sit across from you without demanding reassurance. Growth refines the room, and refinement reduces the crowd. This is where many people turn back. They feel the loneliness and mistake it for regression. They resume explaining, resume over-clarifying, resume performing accessibility. But you don't. Because something inside you has anchored deeper than social comfort. The train slows, your stop approaches. You stand adjusting your coat, heart surprisingly light. You realize the loneliness isn't heavy anymore. It's spacious. And in that space, something else has taken root. A quiet authority. Not dominance. Not control. Authority over your own interior. And when you walk into a room now, something shifts before you speak. But here, the final truth most people miss. The power was never in the silence itself. It was in what the silence revealed. March 27, 2024, 7:13, a rooftop gathering overlooking the city, glass railings, low conversation, wind brushing lightly against tailored coats. The skyline glows in amber and blue, music hums beneath the murmur of voices, someone laughs too loudly near the bar. You're standing near the edge, not isolated, just observant. A familiar face approaches, someone who used to dominate conversations with subtle corrections, someone who once relied on your careful explanations to maintain the upper hand. They tilt their head slightly, "You've been quiet tonight." There it is again. But this time the tone is different. Less curiosity. More assessment. You hold their gaze for a moment longer than expected. "I've said what I needed to," you reply. No edge, no performance. Just truth. A pause stretches between you, not tense, not warm, simply neutral. And in that neutrality, something undeniable settles. You are no longer reacting to the room. The room is reacting to you. From a Jungian perspective, this is the natural outcome of integration. Carl Jung believed that when the unconscious elements of the psyche are acknowledged rather than suppressed, a person becomes internally unified, and unity generates gravity. Gravity doesn't argue. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't chase reassurance. It remains. The wind picks up slightly, you rest your hands against the cool glass railing. The city below feels distant, almost abstract. You remember who you used to be in rooms like this, scanning faces, filling silences, smoothing edges before anyone could label you difficult or distant. You thought you were being emotionally intelligent. In truth, you were being strategically small. Now you're simply proportionate to yourself. Not enlarged. Not diminished. And people feel the difference. A conversation begins nearby, someone debating a topic you have strong opinions about. They glance toward you, expecting immediate engagement. You don't rush in. You listen. And when you finally speak, it's measured, complete, unapologetic. No disclaimers. The group quiets slightly, not because you're louder, but because you're centered. This is the subtle authority of someone who no longer negotiates their existence. You are not harder. You are not colder. You are not detached. You are unmoved by the need to secure understanding. And that unmoving quality changes dynamics in ways words never could. Because when someone cannot be easily unsettled, they cannot be easily steered. When someone does not scramble to clarify, they cannot be easily diminished. When someone allows silence to exist without anxiety, they create psychological space others must choose to enter respectfully. The skyline flickers with distant traffic lights. A helicopter passes slowly overhead, its rhythm steady against the night. You realize something almost ironic. The less you explain yourself, the more clearly you are seen. Not by everyone, but by the right ones. The ones who don't require constant reassurance. The ones who aren't threatened by containment. The ones who recognize depth without needing translation. And perhaps that was the shift all along. Not dominance. Not distance. Discernment. You stopped explaining yourself and something shifted in the room. But the deeper shift happened inside you. You no longer fear being misunderstood. You no longer equate silence with rejection. You no longer abandon parts of yourself to maintain comfort. And when a person reaches that point, their presence changes. It slows. It steadies. It settles into itself. The wind softens, the music fades into background texture, conversations swirl and reform around you, but you remain anchored, not rigid, just rooted. There is no final declaration. No grand transformation speech. Just this. You are here. Untranslated. Unapologetic. Understood first by yourself. And that is enough.